In this next section, I'm going to talk about a framework called Competing Values Framework and how it relates to culture. Competing Values Framework and some of the tests that go along with it is probably the most widely used organizational assessment tool in the world. And if you've taken personality tests, you could think of this almost like a personality test, but for your organization. So let me talk about one of the ways this can be used in your organization. So you're probably familiar with this tension between you have staff who kind of have this ministry culture that, they may have come from, Bible school or church background, and then you have staff that have a business culture. They may have come from the business world or had, business related degrees. And often there is a tension between the two. And what you want to do is you want to have a healthy balance in your organization. Then you also have staff who are in the operations culture, and they're very good at details and controls. And then you have staff who are entrepreneurial. And those two are also at tension. And that's really at the core of what the competing values. The competing values comes from these diagonals. And the idea is that not everyone in an organization needs to have a balance, but the more senior you are, you're going to need to be more balanced because you're going to have to do more general management and you're going to cover more areas. And the other thing is the organization overall needs to be balanced. So this is how it's framed in the competing values framework. You have, the internal versus external, and then you have stability and control versus flexibility. And then you have these four quadrants. I'm kind of renaming CLAN as ministry, ad hocery as entrepreneurial, the compete or market with business, and hierarchy with operations, because I think that's what people are more familiar with in the nonprofit sector. Now, what happens in organizations is they start off, and organizations, and you can take a survey and it's almost like a personality test for your organization that will essentially assess how are you doing in each of these dimensions. And what happens with organizations is they go through a life cycle. So you start off and you're this ad hocracy because you don't have any established systems, and that's your dominant framework. So if you're an early stage startup organization, then this is probably going to be your profile. As you become mid stage, what you're trying to do, you're going to grow in your market capacity. You're going to grow in your relational capacity. But you probably don't have a bunch of established systems. So this is a mid-stage startup. So they're starting to get a lot of, significant budget, but they don't have the established systems. A later stage organization. So these are the organizations that may be at risk of dying because they are not innovating and they're primarily hierarchical and very bureaucratic. Now, sometimes that's going to work great, and other times if the world's changing a lot in their field, their market's changing, they're going to have a hard time. So, and ultimately what you try to do is what happened with Apple recently with Steve Jobs is he reinvented Apple. And same thing happened with Microsoft. So Microsoft went through these stages. It was starting to be a later stage organization, and it got reinvented by adding some of the entrepreneurial components. Now, one of the things we're going to have you do, you can take a free OCAI test where you will map your organization's current state. So the pink or red here is the current state, and then the blue is where you'd prefer to be. So it's going to have two sections. It'll say where are you currently and where do you want to be. And based on that, you kind of can get a diagnosis of what you need to do, with your organization. So this tool isn't just used cross-culturally; it's used for overall organizational health, and it can kind of be a guiding light cross-culturally, though, also. So now, what happens if you have imbalance? So if you are a very focused on cross-cultural, and this is something that I did early on. I said that I'm going to be very focused on cross-cultural and very focused on ministry, but we didn't have enough funding. So you know, and that can be a problem. Now, on the other side, so you know, that was strong collaborative. The other side, you know, being strong creatively, this can create this tumultuous anarchy. So there's no rules, and in the nonprofit world, you might run into fraud or financial mismanagement. You might have sexual abuse happen because you hire a bunch of people and you don't do background checks on them, or you might have lawsuits or government investigations. Then if you're too competitive, you might have burnout from drivenness, you might have secularization and mission drift, or you might just become inaccessible to relational cultures. And then the last is if you're have too strong of a bureaucracy, you might have a slow death from cultural irrelevance and decline. And you might be inaccessible to flexible cultures. You know, if you're the type of church that if you start at 10 o'clock and it's 10:01, you lock your doors and don't let people come in if they're late, you're probably not going to be around or work very well with flexible cultures if you're serving a flexible culture. So that's the cultural risk factors. Now, this competing values framework, also you can look at how does that relate to some of these cultural dimensions and social class. So ultimately, this focused versus flexible, if you are a flexible organization, on average, you're going to be more accessible to the lower classes in the developing world. And if you're a focused organization, you're going to be more accessible to the upper classes in the developed world. So a lot of the big megachurches, so they're very strong on both control and compete. A lot of the, smaller charismatic churches might be, more accessible to the lower classes in the developing world. So I also want to map competing values leadership to some of the cultural dimensions we talked about. So not all of the dimensions can easily be mapped, but a lot of them can. So you have this tension between the parochial versus the professional, the relationship-oriented versus the task-oriented, the process means-oriented versus goal-oriented. You have the cooperative versus competitive, long-term orientation, short-term orientation. Then you have loose control up here versus tight control. And some of these are going to be Hofstede's dimensions. Some of these are going to be Hofstede's organizational dimensions. Uncertainty acceptance, uncertainty avoidance, low power distance. So, that a lot of the .com startups, they act like everyone's the same. High power distance, hierarchical. You have to have a hierarchy if you're going to have a lot of control. And then this flexible time versus linear time is going to be up, the top and bottom. So ultimately, what we're trying to do in our organizations is we're trying to create organizational health and to serve our clients as effectively as possible. And to do that, we're trying to be bridge builders. So on one hand, and this kind of relates to the top of the diagram on competing values framework. For a lot of us, we're serving clients that are maybe lower resourced or more flexible than the organization. And then on the other hand, we might have in nonprofits, we'll have funders or dominant culture where we're getting resources. And how you're going to handle this is you're going to have, usually you'll have junior program staff on the front lines that are going to be close to the clients, and you're going to have junior operations and development staff that are going to be close to the funders. So, that I would say that's more the mid-level managers. But if you want to be a senior manager, you're going to need to be a balanced bridge builder. So the question is, how do you get to that? And how do you even know what ways you should grow? Well, that's what the next profile that we're going to have you do. So the first tool for competing values framework is to assess the organization. The second tool is to assess yourself individually. We're going to have you go through a series of spreadsheets where you're going to look, and it's going to measure you across 12 dimensions, but each of the 12 dimensions, 3 of them will map to one of the quadrants in competing values framework. And you're going to go through this exercise. You're going to fill out the spreadsheet. And if you want, you could also have other people do it from your organization that know you. And then what you're going to do is you're going to get this thing called a workplace behavior profile, and it will look like a chart like this. And you'll see where your strengths or weaknesses. And if you have two lines, the green line would be if other people rated you. And what you want to try to do is you want to look at what's happening with the organization and what are your strengths. So in this case, this organization is actually City Vision, right? We need to move. We've been very entrepreneurial, very clan focused, and as we grow as an organization, we have to move down. Ultimately, what that's meant for me, this isn't my map. I didn't go through this map, but ultimately, if you looked at my map's going to look more like this pink diagram. And ultimately, for me to lead the organization where it needs to go, I need to grow in some of these other capacities. Now, what that's gonna be a challenge for a lot of people, because in many ways ministries in general focus on, first focus on your strength, and that's what you should do. But everyone has, if you're right-handed, you have a right hand and a left hand. And often, as your organization matures, you're going to need to strengthen your left hand, and you're going to need to hire other people. So you're not going to do it all yourself. You'll need to hire people that can strengthen that. So my most recent hires have all been down here, but part of the issue was I couldn't effectively manage them if I couldn't track the details with them. So ultimately, what you're going to do is you're going to have to figure out what are the learning domains do you need to grow in, and you can use this to kind of think through. You can take that map and you can say, what are the domains that you want to learn in, and where do you want to grow? And what I've done is I've taken City Vision's courses and I've mapped them to these quadrants. So we have our ministry and relational courses. So cross-cultural management and ministry is really a ministry mindset course. And there's a lot of other courses. And what I find is ministry people love these courses. But then they take our business courses and they're incredibly frustrated because that's their left hand. But honestly, usually that's the courses they need to learn the most. And same thing with operations courses. Operations people or, versus innovation people. I don't like operations courses. One of the things I did recently is I helped rewrite our nonprofit startup and board development course, because that was largely about governance. And I needed to grow in my own governance. So as a part of doing that, rewriting the course, I was learning in my own self. But if you're an innovator, if you're an entrepreneur, you don't like accounting. But if you can't manage the accounting and supervise accountants, then you're going to be in trouble. So ultimately, you need to kind of come up with a map of where do you need to grow. So the idea behind this is you're going to look at where's your organization, where are you, and then where do you need to grow. Now, our different degrees, just to explain, our ministry degree is more in the clan space. Our business degree is more in the market space, and our nonprofit degree is right in the middle. So hopefully that will be helpful. Your assignment this week is going to be to look both at your organization and yourself, and this information should feed back into some of your final projects. So if you have any questions, just ask your instructor.